The regional program RECONOMY seeks to contribute to inclusive economic development to women and youth, including other disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in 12 countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. We use an inclusive systems approach, also known as market systems development approach. To achieve this objective, the design and management of the program needs to be flexible and adaptable, and be able to continuously learn from and react to the ever-changing and evolving nature of the problems, which the program addresses in skills development, financial and business services, and advocacy systems. So in this episode, I will talk to inclusive economic development experts at Agora Global, Ben Taylor, Niall Condon, James Lloyd, and Justin van Rhyn, about what the regional program RECONOMY is trying to do and how it will work in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Niall, James, and Justin, could you tell me about the market systems analysis for RECONOMY regions? What are the key takeaways? What are the findings relevant for the regional program RECONOMY, and what can be improved?
Well, thank you, Sabine. So this is probably the 6th or 7th market systems analysis that I've worked on. It's the first I've done for the South Caucasus and the first that I've done fully remotely from the UK, from Dorset. And so we had to work very closely with colleagues in Helvetas and also STA, which is a co-facilitator based in Armenia. Now, there's a very common methodology applied to the market systems analysis, and that was adopted in the terms of reference and my work for the South Caucasus. So this firstly looks at the target group, in this case, youth and women. What is their situation? What challenges do they face? What opportunities are there? And then look at sectors that are particularly relevant for this target group. So in the South Caucasus, women and youth, and then look at growth trajectories, look at the position of the target group in those sectors, challenges and constraints to the growth of those sectors to inform the design of interventions. So what we hope to do was to provide some shape to inform the implementation phase of the program, because there's lots of choices that RECONOMY has to make, and it's important to be able to communicate why those choices were made, but also to have the choices made on good evidence and to deliver the most efficient and effective use of resources for CEDA.
Okay, thanks, Abin. So there's a lot, so that's a very big question. So let me speak first about the region I was working on. So obviously RECONOMY has, in terms of its geographical coverage, the project is very large, right? It's 12 countries across a huge geographical area. So the region I was looking at was the Western Balkans, which is 6 countries. So it's Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, and I'm missing one there, right? Which country am I missing? I think I named 5.
Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Oh, Bosnia and Herzegovina, yeah. Okay, and the purpose of the market systems analysis was to provide some early stage data, early stage analysis to inform the design of RECONOMY. And so the analysis had there was 2 very broad questions we were looking at. One is we were looking at who's actually working, right? So this was to provide us with some insights into RECONOMY's target group. So again, the target group is very broad. It's women and young people. So to understand within that group, who's doing better, who's getting the better jobs, who seems to be, having better labor market outcomes. So we looked at some of the data there, and then on the other hand, we wanted to look at, okay, so where are the jobs actually being generated? Which sectors are growing? Which sectors are creating jobs? So those were 2, and then based on that, we provide some very broad recommendations on what RECONOMY can do next. So if I look at the first question on who's working, what we've seen across the Western Balkans, very broadly, right, across the 6 countries, you've seen reductions in unemployment over the past decade, 15 years, very significantly across all groups and all age groups. And there's a number of things happening there, right? So reductions in unemployment are driven on the one hand by actual job creation, right? People are getting more jobs. But secondly, migration has helped to actually reduce unemployment. And so you've seen, I mean, across all of the countries, I would say, with the exception of Kosovo, you've seen reductions in the labor force, significant reductions across all countries over the past 10 years. So there's huge numbers of young people in particular are leaving. And this is something we can come back to in a bit, but I think this is positive and negative implications for the region.
What about in terms of migration and diaspora?
So very, very briefly, for example, it's, there's a huge, these people send back huge remittances to the region, which are, supporting families, particularly in rural areas, which tend to be poor. And there's also as well, the diaspora is a huge kind of repository of knowledge, new skills, information, which I don't think countries in the region have tapped into as of yet. So that's what's happening in the labor markets. You have seen reductions in unemployment.
What about in terms of inequality? What's the overall picture there?
You're seeing a lot of inequality in a sense, in terms of who's able to access labor market opportunities. I mean, very broadly, and this is, something you see in other countries, the better educated tend to have access to better opportunities in the labor market. I mean, that's not only from, having, better skills, better education, but it's also the networks they get, right, through their education, because these people tend to be, and access to education then is very much linked to your socioeconomic background. So the better off tend to go to the better schools, they get the better jobs, they have better networks. So you're seeing that inequality is coming out very clearly. And then you're seeing a big urban-rural divide in most of these countries. So there's a lot of, on the one hand, you're seeing migration from east to west, so people leaving the region, but also there's huge intra-country migration within these countries, right? From the countryside into the major urban areas. So I mean, you know yourself from North Macedonia, right? I mean, the countryside in Albania here, for example, I mean, the countryside is deserted. It's like, it tends to be old people and, maybe very young people, but that's sort of the people who really sort of drive growth, the people with the new ideas, with energy, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, there's very few of those people. A lot of those people are migrating to urban areas in search of work.
Another area of inequality that was quite interesting was this urban-rural divide, which you see in a lot of countries around the world, but particularly pronounced in this situation. So what you had was quite a different set of challenges facing rural young people in terms of access to good quality education, in terms of access to networks, jobs. What we found in places like Belarus were you have certain rural communities that are incredibly reliant, maybe just on one large employer in the vicinity, and that can increase vulnerability in a situation where that single employer starts to face difficulties, as a result of COVID more recently, or just changes in the economy. And then other dimensions of inequality, ethnic and linguistic minorities, people with lower levels of education.
What about in terms of gender divide?
If we look at gender aspects of inequality, quite an interesting picture emerged as well. So when you look at the aggregate level, inequality is actually quite low by some measures on a gender basis. But when you delve a little bit deeper, what you see is some pretty stark labor market segregation. So women being relegated to lower paid positions within sectors, but also into lower paying sectors. So, retail, low paid hospitality jobs, etc. There are also challenges faced by groups like mothers looking to return to work after having looked after their children for a period of time. And so, you know, dimensions like that quite interesting to think about as we go into the next steps of developing interventions.
You have seen, I mean, women are doing well across most of the countries in the labour market. And I mean, that's what the kind of macro level data is telling us. But again, if you dig a bit deeper into that, you'll see that a lot of, I mean, women are accessing jobs, but the reductions in unemployment are also driven by a lot of women are leaving the labour market. So if you look at, for example, say in Bosnia, you'll see that, you know, the unemployment data for women is telling you that it's pretty much halved over the past decade. But that's virtually been entirely driven by women actually leaving the labour market rather than them actually getting new job opportunities. And again, there's a lot of inequality there. Women in urban areas tend to have better access to education, and again, they have are better able to access the jobs market. But again, but very generally, I think it is difficult for women to balance, you know, sort of access, say, to childcare facilities, these types of things. I think women face a lot of disadvantages when it comes to accessing the labour market.
And where are jobs being created? Could you tell us more?
The vast majority of jobs that have been created over the past decade have tended to be in services. And that's a global phenomenon. So if you look at, you've seen a decline in manufacturing across all of these countries over the past decade, 20 years, with some recovery in some countries. So for example, in Serbia, you've seen the resurgence of the auto industry, which is now a very significant employer in the country. But again, in general, the manufacturing has been in decline, which was traditionally a very strong source of employment. And if you look at where the jobs are now, it tends to be services, and typically it's low value services. So by low value, I mean it's services where, you know, for example, the retail sector, construction, hospitality, where job security isn't very high. I mean, skills requirements aren't very high. So it's typically very precarious employment. And so those three, I would say, construction, retail, hospitality, the vast majority of job creation has been in those sectors over the past 10, 15 years. And the thing is, I mean, on the one hand, obviously this is creating, you know, much needed employment, but on the other hand, it tends to be precarious. So for example, during COVID, I think you saw a lot of people in those sectors have obviously suffered badly, right? In a sense, there's been very big job losses, and also a lot of the employment in those sectors tends to be informal. And so that creates a couple of problems. One is that the you know, businesses in those sectors aren't able to access government support. And secondly, as well, the people don't really have the protection that they would have with if they were employed formally.
What we found as well was that when you look at how these economies are structured, you know, in line with experiences around the world, you know, that there is a shift from in this case manufacturing and agriculture into services. But what we found with a lot of economies target group were where they were working in lower value services, so retail jobs, you know, hotel and restaurant work, you know, things like motor vehicle repair. Agriculture a little bit mixed. There was some engagement, but generally, again, it's sort of in line with trends around the world. You know, less interest in young people in agricultural jobs. We see another trend, which was you know, incredibly high educational attainment and enrollment. You know, some of the highest in the world. But in speaking to young people in interviews and focus groups in all three countries, actually, they all express this view that the relevance of the educational system to the world of work was not always there. Quite theory-based models, models maybe based on the way these economies used to operate. And you know, we see a big challenge there, but also an incredible opportunity to get these education systems a little bit more aligned with what employers are looking for today. Those are some of the trends that we observed across the countries. But when you look at the individual countries, you know, there are some interesting nuances as well. One of them was youth outlook, so a really mixed bag, and you know, ranging from Belarus, which you know, outlooks and attitudes were probably the most negative, through to Ukraine, where youth attitudes were very positive about the future, with Moldova somewhere in the middle. So, you know, as we design interventions, thinking through that sort of the attitudes and perceptions that young people have about their countries, about their prospects, you know, very important to bear those in mind.
Going back to migration, what kind of people leave the region and for what reasons?
You see, there are job opportunities being created in the region. But so for example, a lot of migration is from better educated people, right? You know, for example, you hear a lot of stories about medical professionals who are leaving the region. And these people a lot of people have opportunities to actually work, but they're still migrating, right? And a lot of the reasons there is, for example, in one of your previous podcasts, you spoke about some of the reasons behind that. So obviously there's people have access to jobs here, but they feel they can get better quality jobs doing the same thing in, for example, Germany or Switzerland or places like that. But all other reasons, right? In the sense of, you know, one of the things is that people feel that, I think you mentioned on the previous podcast, they feel like that maybe the political and social environment in their home countries is very conservative, right? So they want to go somewhere where, you know, they can be, you know, have more freedom. So there's a lot of decisions which are informing migration. It's not just the fact that you can't get a job. You know, I think there are opportunities being created here, and I think that's positive for RECONOMY, because it creates. I think there are a lot of opportunities for the program to do interesting things.
What we found as well in the Eastern European countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, was that it wasn't just unemployment; it was also wage levels. So we found a lot of the young people that we spoke to, you know, they were able to access a job, but it might have been an unpaid internship, it might have been a very low paid entry level wage. What we also found was that some of the working conditions that they were operating under were a lot more precarious. So either informal work, or in cases where there were formal contracts, the terms didn't offer very good protection. So, you know, yes, unemployment rates were higher, but there are these extra dimensions that we also uncovered as we sort of went through the research process.
So, Justin, what are the sectors that may have potential in the Eastern Europe?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I think what we're seeing is you've got pretty strong ICT sectors in all three countries. You know, Ukraine, for example, massive software development industry now. You've got things like high-tech manufacturing in Belarus, which, you know, it's relatively small. There are some really interesting leading players there. And then Moldova, you know, well-known wine industry, tourism, again, ICT. I think the challenge here is that all of those high growth sectors, you know, they can potentially grow the economy, but, you know, there may be barriers to entry for some of the poorest, most marginalized youth. So, you know, there's that, the classic trade-off between promoting growth and trying to ensure that the target groups can benefit from that growth.
How has the pandemic affected?
What we found is, you know, I think in general these economies are going to undergo a period of contraction, like is happening everywhere in the world. And probably sort of most pronounced in areas like, you know, retail, hospitality, construction, but But then what we found as well was that there are areas like ICT, where you have more innovative startups who are really they've embraced the situation and are offering products around working from home, learning languages, learning skills, that seem to be this has presented a real opportunity to them. So probably a mixed bag in terms of impacts. But again, coming back to that point on inequality, the ability to get through a challenging period, it's much higher for groups that have access to finance and information and can work from home. And unfortunately, people that are not in that fortunate position, they're much more hard hit.
What made this market systems analysis quite unique was COVID, and also the fact that a conflict erupted midway through the market systems analysis. Now, I had, as in any case, resources are constrained. I had 15 days to cover 3 countries. So it could be interpreted that it was a very high-level analysis. We were requested to conduct workshops and interviews. Those weren't able to happen face to face. So we relied a lot on secondary data, of which there was so much. And so it was important during the analysis to draw out what was important, what was relevant. And the workshops and interviews did happen, but they were delayed a little bit more. I think that particularly in understanding the sectors, what the constraints are to growth, further engagement with stakeholders will be necessary, and indeed I think that is planned. I think SDA and Helvetas and I worked very well together as a team. We had weekly catch-ups, provided regular updates internally within Helvetas, and again we have very close interactions also with my colleagues from Agora Global, Niall and Justin, covering other countries, regions. I think with COVID in particular, so much changed last year that it was really important to get a current hold on the dynamics of the target group and also the sectors within, and that was compounded obviously by the conflict. So a little bit more emphasis perhaps on real-time information, looking at leading indicators might have been useful for the program, and that's something that can definitely be built in.
Ben, what are the key takeaways of conducting market systems analysis of this size within this duration and limited resources? What can we learn and what needs to be improved?
RECONOMY is a very large and ambitious program. It's one of very few programs that have attempted to adopt a market systems development approach with a regional mandate. And regional means several different things to several different people, and it's something that we have kind of used this and other experiences that Agora have been part of to try to kind of understand and codify a bit more. So I think firstly, the regional mandate can mean that you're trying to address common problems between countries. So by working in several countries, you can learn something from one and apply it in another. You can also address shared problems which exist between across borders, which is often a problem where you operate with single country mandates that don't have license to, if there's an intervention partner that exists in a different country across the border, you don't really have license to develop a relationship and provide them with funding or support. And it can also lead to efficiencies in terms of common actors. So there may be multinational companies where it's not sufficient to get the interest to engage in a single small nation with a single market. But once you're offering 12 countries and 12 markets and a common approach, then all of a sudden you've got a bit more sway. So those are the 3 sort of parameters by which a regional program is justified and where a market systems development approach might make sense to adopt with a regional as opposed to a multi-country program. And so the stage we're at now with RECONOMY, we have to try somehow with limited resources in terms of Agora, limited resources in terms, and in fact more so in terms of the teams on the ground. We have to do market systems analysis, which includes understanding and scoping the position of target groups, clarifying who those target groups are, understanding the systems and sectors in which they're involved, and trying to understand how those systems work on a 12-country basis. Some of those countries don't have permanent staff members for the RECONOMY program in them. Some of them, we have very little experience, certainly limited networks, which are important for understanding constraints and developing interventions. So very, very challenging is the summary answer. And we're just really in the first incremental stages of kind of making progress along that diagnostic process, where we've gathered information, we understand the kind of macroeconomic conditions, but the differentiator of the MSD approach as opposed to other approaches is that granularity. You know, why does that person in that company behave in a certain way, and how do we get that behavior to change? We're not going to know that from this kind of helicopter view that we've got at the moment. So what we're in the process of right now, and we plan to continue, is to deepen that to a granular level, probably being selective in terms of where we go deep and making some relatively quick and dirty normative judgments on, you know, geographies or sectors, or you've got to start somewhere. And the pilots that RECONOMY has, you know, the sort of quick win pilots that RECONOMY is engaged in are providing some of that information, you know, learn by doing. But we're also going to engage in a parallel kind of more formalized diagnostic process. But even for that, we're going to have to make some assumptions and kind of dive in with them. So if you were to look for generalizable lessons from this, then I think you need to be selective about where you deploy your resources. RECONOMY will end up being a 12-country program, or at least having impact in 12 countries. But there are several different ways it might get there. If you think of those three sort of categories of rationales for a regional program that I described, the common problems, to understand that there are common problems, you have to have a deep diagnostic process in each of these countries. But you may get to the point where you start work in one country, and then you get to learn over time that it does apply elsewhere without having done that diagnostic process. So you may start the diagnosis in, say, 5 countries and go, or you've done the helicopter view, and then you take it down a step in 5 countries, then you end up with 3 sectors in 5 or 3 countries or something, but then you build it back up from there. And, you know, across a 7-year program, you don't need to do everything at once. You just need to make sure that what you are doing is good, of good quality. So yeah, I think trying to balance the kind of rigor and pragmatism of needing to do things quickly, but also do them well. And I think it results in a kind of rolling mandate, so that you roll these things out over time rather than trying to, you know, upscale from the first minute. And those are the kind of lessons of trying to spread yourself thinly, I suppose, from what we've done so far.
All right. Thank you for watching another round of Inclusive Plug powered by RECONOMY. So what do you think? Please send us your thoughts in the comment section below. We have interesting topics coming up, so stay tuned and hit the subscribe button. This was Sabine, a communication manager at RECONOMY, a program of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency implemented by Helvetas in 12 countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Thank you for tuning in, and see you soon.